Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Growth Show. I'm joined with Tom, David and Ollie today, making up our expert panel. We are going to be exploring firing from a leader's point of view, of firing people, but also from an employee's point of view. Very sensitive subject, not very much talked about, but we're going to try, in our usual style, shed a bit of our own light and experience on how we can go about this and turn it, hopefully, into a positive experience. So, Tom, firing, kick us off.
Yeah, I've got an unusual experience of firing, both in terms of being fired, Nick, in my early career, when I found myself in taking on battles I couldn't cope with, frankly, and also then having, as a turnaround guy, having fired a lot of people. So I've got quite an interesting perspective and I'd like to share both sides of the fence. I think the first thing to acknowledge is that life is very difficult. And I think it's very easy to think that we know all the answers to these questions, but I'm certainly going to share it from a humble perspective, despite the fact I'm a bit older than when I faced some of these challenges early on in my career. So I think it's worth acknowledging things are much worse for people on the shop floor because they have very fewer options than we have as leaders. And I think the next rung down from that are actually people who aren't in the workplace at all, who are severely disabled, actually. It's something that struck me today that we shouldn't lose sight of, and also the importance of work. So I think the first thing to talk about, I think, is around how difficult it is to speak up. We've talked about speaking up and free speech, but actually there's a real cost to that, and it's a real threat in a lot of situations, and I'll give some examples of that. One most public example is the VW emissions scandal, where that issue of emissions would have been known. And I've worked in automotive, but it's a very aggressive industry. And you try speaking up, you will get fired. And so that individual knew about it, simply would not have been able to do that. So that's the first thing I'd add. I think as well, there's a challenge as to whether or not you put in the company first or yourself first. So, and even when I was doing really, the thing that struck me is even when I was doing really well in my career, in inverted commas, running award-winning businesses with really high results, I found myself in a bit of a vegetative state. And I found quite a few situations where, I'd run into the politics of an organization and just, so the big question is, have we got the courage to actually raise difficult issues, I think, Nick? Because very much it's a job's worth situation. And I think my most earliest experience of being fired was actually very difficult for me, and actually reflecting on this was quite a difficult thing, even to talk about now, but I thought I would, because it's something that certainly isn't on people's CVs. How many times have you been fired? But I think when I was quite early on in my automotive career, I joined this site, which was actually a sort of neoliberal little enclave. It was a very high profile part of an automotive business, but with a very weird leadership style that I had no idea. And I walked into a situation and I was actually accused of not fitting in, which early on in my career was actually very difficult, and I had no idea of how to address that, and I ended up getting fired. The interesting thing about that was, small world, the guy who actually was the next level up who fired me, actually then I met him later on in my career, and so I think it's a very difficult thing that we don't talk about very much. And later on in my career as well, I joined an automotive business. I was a director of an automotive business when I was about 28. The managing director was an amazing bully. I mean, really, really big bully. And his PA, who was absolutely delightful, used to say to me, I was the only person that ever stood up to him, which was interesting. This guy was utterly unchallengeable, and he had some very diffusive leadership traits, which were effectively smoke screens. And it's taken me to an age I'm now to actually know how to address that type of thing. But the response you got was just ballistic, and lots of generalizations, that would be made. So if there's an isolated instance, it would be made into generalization. And needless to say, that job didn't last very long, because I don't tolerate that sort of thing. And I think the other thing I'd add as well is that I think women, actually, people always talk about women in senior management. I think women are far less tolerant of just dreadful leadership. So I think we really do need to acknowledge dreadful leadership. I think the antithesis of that actually is how I've accommodated that in my working style. So I reached a point after I was very successful when I was about 28. everything on the face of it was really good. I was earning a lot of money, driving nice cars, nice house in Tunbridge Wells, all the sort of ticks in the boxes. But actually, I just couldn't work for another corporate culture. I'll be honest. And I was going through the interview processes and just thought it was absolute rubbish. And so I started a business. My purpose was actually to find a place that people really wanted to work in, and I mean genuinely wanted to work in. And I employed alcoholics, and I employed old ladies, all kinds of people. And I employed a really unionized guy who was kicked out of a business because he was bloody awkward. And by giving them the right opportunities, this unionized guy, actually I promoted him 3 times in 1 month, and he's eventually running the factory. So, you know, and the alcoholic guy, actually I had a real heart for him, you know, in terms of, you know, providing him opportunities. Sometimes he didn't turn up to work, but when he did, he was great. And I wasn't going to fire him. And I think, but the one thing I did fire someone in that business who was actually the sales manager I took on, because I did most of the sales. And we grew to number 2 in the UK in the market sector we're operating in. But this guy was just too cozy. And the thing about that I noticed was he couldn't take new action. So that was the sort of learning there. And I think just a bit further on in my career as well, when I've fired hundreds and hundreds of, so that's my experience of being fired in terms of, or how, but in between times, I've fired a lot of people as well in terms of site closures. And I think what I've learned from that is you've got to be fair to people. So it's all the things we're already talking about. So whilst there may be a site closure, you can be very fair to people within that window. And I've had many organizations who've said, or individuals said to me that during that period of time when I was working with you, it was the best part of my career. And actually, even people who were quite beaten by the corporate cultures, who'd gone along with a status quo and fallen into the tyrannies of tolerance, which frankly I wasn't willing to do, went on to great, you know, even within 2 or 3 months. One of the most striking things was when I shut Huntley Healthcare, it employed about 400 people and moved it to Poland. There was an interesting thing with that as well, actually. It got to the Sun newspaper, because the weird thing was we were moving the site to Poland and we had some Polish people, and yet the Polish people weren't actually invited to go and work in Poland, and we had no foresight of that. So aware of what unexplained or unexpected outcomes. But the real point I wanted to shine a light on that was that within this window, you know, in terms of getting the engagement right, the delivery right to move the site, you know, people actually came to me and said, look, this is the best experience I've ever had in 20 years, even though I was getting rid of the whole lot of them during their redundancy period, and we were running a really difficult period. So I think, Nick, that's what I'd say is a sort of introductory thing, hopefully to whet people's appetite for either being fired or, you know, identify where we have been fired and find the courage to talk about that, or, you know, what's the right way to let people exit the business.
Yeah, and David, you're dealing with founders of fast-growing companies day in, day out. There is no one in the world who actually enjoys, from a leadership point of view, enjoys the process of firing people. Well, there might be, but hopefully we don't know them. But
I know one or two.
What are the sort of challenges you're seeing when you're sort of coaching and mentoring them through some of these sort of horrible periods?
Yeah, it is right. It's very rare to meet someone who enjoys it. I've met one or two, and interesting characters, but you know, very few people enjoy it. And one of the things that, you know, I always say to the clients I work with is, how did it get to this point? Because it's probably not their fault. It's probably a fault in the recruitment process, which I'm sure you could speak far better to than I can, Nick. But if you've got a sort of a round peg in a square hole and it's just not working, that's okay. But how did it get there? How did you recruit the wrong person for the job in the first place? So yeah, that can be, that's the sort of the first point. The second thing is often in these fast growing companies, someone who was really good 12 or 24 months ago, who said, oh great, you can be head of marketing when we've got 5 people and that'll help you get your foot in the door somewhere. Suddenly when you've got 35 people in the company and they just don't have the experience for it, and you need to get someone who can do international marketing, or whatever it is, that can be really hard because you've had someone who's joined you at the ground floor of a business, they've helped build it up, and suddenly you're saying to them, you're not quite good enough for that next level. And that can be really tough. So one of the things that I encourage people to do at a really early stage is just have very open conversations with the employees about where they see themselves in 2 to 3 years' time. Because other than the founders, there'll be very few people in a company who, if that company then sells or IPOs or whatever, most other people will have to get another job. They might be mortgage free, they might have got great stock options or something else, but they'll probably have to get another job. So therefore, as a founder, as a senior team, why not create, if you could go, let's invest in this person to get them into the best position for their next role, then let's start talking about that 2 years before we then have to have an awkward conversation, so they can actually transition really nicely. Because these fast growing companies, it is hard. You're constant, it's evolving and changing as you're growing. And actually, if you can have those kind of open conversations early, you don't really ever then get to the point where you need to fire somebody. It sort of has a natural sort of life cycle within the business, and you can then start preparing them really, really well for the next role. The last thing I'd probably say on this moment is, often when someone gets fired, it's not necessarily them. It's just they were in the wrong role, wrong role for them, or the wrong business, or the wrong time, or whatever it is. And as everyone says, the shame of being fired, or the embarrassment, the stigma that comes with it is really, really tough. Often, loads of people then come back and say, oh, it was the best thing that ever happened. If I wasn't fired from that job, I'd have stayed in that job that I didn't really like. I wasn't very good at it, but that spurred me on to do this, which I love. So most of the time, the stories end really, really well. It's the sort of stigmas around it. And I think just being really open and honest with people and just saying, look, this is the situation. It's not you. We just, sometimes it just isn't you. And we're just trying to find the right fit, and we made some mistakes, but how can we help you into the next thing?
Yeah. And I think that feedback element is key. Like, people get annoyed, angry when it's a surprise, right? And the shock factor getting hit them all at once, which I guess, Ollie, being from the elite sporting world, I mean, you could just be dropped like that, right? I guess there's less of a feedback loop, and you could just be hit instantly and like, yeah, you're just not playing this week, here's some feedback, and you have to deal with it. What was your experience of seeing people dropped or firing from your world?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, we would get hired and fired pretty much every week, on and off, depending on whether you play well or didn't play well. I think, building on something that the chap sort of mentioned, obviously you've got to look at the human psychology around and human behaviour side of firing or whatever, right? As human beings, we like to feel loved, we like to feel appreciated, we want to feel valued, etc. So as a concept, that notion of rejection, which is the stigma that David sort of spoke around, doesn't bode well, right? It's two negatives meeting, which aren't good. And I think that whole process is exacerbated when there isn't transparency and honesty and, if you like, a clear process to it. So some of the best teams that I ever played in and the best coaches that I played with, they were just honest and true to their word. So if they told you stuff at, let's say, the start of the week, and that they needed to see happening in your game and in your performances and whatever else, and you didn't deliver that, then that would therefore merit you not playing, right? That would be and as a player, as a person, you would, you wouldn't like it, but equally you would be able to understand it and accept it and appreciate it, and then you would feel valued and you would feel part of the group when you did deliver on those certain things and you got your place in the team and you retained your, retained your spot, or you got a contract increase or whatever else. The issues came for me with the worst coaches who basically avoided that conversation.
Right.
They didn't like that feedback loop. They didn't value the, that open, those values of sort of open transparency and honesty. And they didn't deliver against their word ultimately. And if you want an example of a team right now that delivers on that promise, and irrespective of what you think of them for their off-field dealings, Saracens are a team that live and breathe that, right? They operate a policy whereby players will know 3 weeks in advance whether they're going to be playing or not playing. They'll know what's expected of them. They know the strategy and tactics that they're team/organisation expects of them to deliver. And if they deliver against that, they'll play their 3-game slot, and then they'll have a rest of 3-game slot. And there's a recognition and an appreciation in the squad that this is actually for the good of the squad, and actually for their own personal development. It's good for them that they do this. They get to see and watch what's happening. Their bodies recover. They can go again. So that's when it works. You don't deliver against promises. You don't have those open lines of communication and clear transparency all the way through. And then people get something that they don't expect, right? They don't expect, or they can't understand the narrative, and therefore they feel it's either unjust or that they've been sort of hoodwinked or whatever else. All those negative stigma. Whereas actually, there is a way of framing it so that it's a positive, right? You're not part of this organisation, not because we don't want you, but actually you're much better somewhere else.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the line of communication is not open and transparent of getting to that point, that we immediately look at it as why me? Why not somebody else? Why didn't you tell me this years ago? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're the bad managers for me, and the really good ones are, if you get fired, it's not really a firing, if that makes sense, because you expect it, and actually you understand and appreciate that this organisation, this environment isn't the right one for you.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that constant feedback loop is brilliant. Like my experience of people leaving a business I've run is that there's a pretty much common understanding and sort of hug at the end, where we know we've been on a journey and we've given every opportunity to succeed, and it just hasn't, for whatever reasons, maybe worked out this time. Doesn't mean it doesn't work out somewhere else. But one of the things I find in the business world is you have to be brave to sort of have those conversations and not get tied into HR. Like, as soon as you HR up or legal up on these conversations, they become the most inhumane conversations you're ever going to have, and create horrible dynamics. Like David, we're told breaking bad news, you're meant to just say, I've got bad news, break it, move on, usher them out the door. Like, it's a pretty cold way you're meant to let people go. Do you think leaders right now just need to be braver to sort of step away from HR policies and just keep human conversations going forward?
It's a really interesting one. I think when having those kind of human conversations, you're as soon as things, lawyers get involved or something like that, you're treading a very fine line where you could say something that could be misinterpreted, and that could open up for exposure, which is why the legal things are done in the way they are and why it's cold. And I think that's the really tricky thing. I was speaking to someone the other day, he's not a client, and I just said, look, you said 3 things in this meeting. Any one of them could have, if taken the wrong way, could have ended up in a HR disaster for you. You didn't mean it like that, but what you mean is often not what's heard, and that's a challenge.
David, can I just dive in? Dave, do you mind if I just,
because
one of the reasons I think around that is that organisations don't invest enough time, money, energy into coaching and developing senior management to be able to have those consistent, honest, transparent conversations, so that ultimately when D-Day comes, you fundamentally don't really need HR, because each person that's sat on either side of that table is expecting what you're going to say. You've come to a mutual recognition of, you know what, I'm not performing, this isn't the right environment for me, I need to go and apply my trade elsewhere. The reason why it becomes an HR nightmare is because that hasn't happened the whole way through. You're having to deliver a curveball to somebody that's not expecting it. It's going to be awkward, and therefore you've not even been coached you've not coached that person all the way through. You've not, as a senior manager, been coached about how to manage this process. So the whole thing is fraught with fear, legal concern, saying the wrong thing. Like, the moment that you realise you've got to fire somebody, it fills you with dread. nobody's been made aware of this whole process the whole way through, and you're left the one to sort of kick the can and do the dirty work, and you've got to make sure that, you know, legally you don't say the wrong thing, and that's where I think the hole is, or the missing link is.
100% agreed. I think if you're getting to that point where the legal side's kicking in, you're already love 40 down and 2 sets and 5 games down in the game. You know, that's the sort of nightmare scenario when you're in those sort of situations.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right that if people do things far better earlier in a process, those conversations are very, very easy, and everyone actually leaves on really good terms. And I've seen that. It's just always these things should never be a surprise. And exactly as you said, Ollie, that's sort of, when you get to that point, it's very hard to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube. Very, very hard. And so I think that's sort of where it, you know, those two worlds collide. I think and that's where, you know, you really need to be investing in people much earlier in those conversations. I read a stat the other day that said the 3% of any training budget is spent on middle managers. So that's the sort of big part of an organisation where they're just not invested into. And that then leads to the problem of, you know, your team's not performing, who in your team isn't performing, who needs to go. Yeah. And the middle manager who hasn't, you know, been equipped or trained to sort of manage them properly then has a horrible situation. And that's, you know, where these things come out. So I think teams and organisations that really invest into that side of things and preparing people and training people to do these things have very, very few problems.
Yeah, I think that said though, there's there's very low awareness of that, David, as well. I think one of the things I notice is that my mentor, John Webster, of 15 years, said, people are always doing the best they can. No one's trying to do a bad job, but they're just developed a certain skill set, a way of coping. And I think there's a couple of points I'd like to add. One is businesses can only offer what they can offer. Okay, so that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, and I've certainly made a mess of this myself when I've been fired, is actually recognise it's a small world. As a young man, it's quite easy to leave a bit of a, this things that, if they're handled badly, can get very, very acrimonious unnecessarily when it goes wrong. I think there are also people in the wrong roles. Very often when I arrive in organisations, you've got an MD who's a commercial director, or the wrong way around, or and the wrong people get fired, when in fact, actually, if you ask people what they're good at doing, you can put them in the right role. I think this neoliberal thing is an absolute nightmare, okay, because people do not have the skills to handle it at all. So you talked about the HR process. At the moment, you can get stitched up over anything, David. So it's not 3, there's 50. In fact, last night, there was a huge explosion in a local organisation that I was involved in, and it was all neoliberal stuff that was just getting out of control. So we shouldn't underestimate the skills for that. I think when you do let people go, it's very important, even if it's redundancy, if you fired them, you know, for whatever reason, you thank them for the contribution to the business. It's something that costs nothing and it has a huge return. I think, I'm on a positive note, I've actually shut entire distribution centres with no HR process whatsoever by treating people fairly, and I've had no fallout either. So, you know, certainly no utopia, but actually, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the skills to do this. This is why the winning thinking process is what it is, because it enables us to exactly have a relationship so that when we're delivering information, even though it's imperfect, it's well received. I run on an MBA program a while ago, just reflecting on Ashridge. I did an exercise where the other catch for this is to wait till the perfect moment or the perfect words. No, right? I run an exercise actually in Ashridge, and they were all trying to find the right words. I said, no, just do it, because when things are difficult, we find awkwardness in our words. I said, no, just have that conversation. And even though you get it wrong, it's okay to get the conversation wrong, but it's much better to get the conversation wrong than not have that conversation at all. So I think certainly even in my early career, when I've been a bold young man, I found it difficult to have that. But it took me a long time to realise that actually the relationship side of this is absolutely paramount, to deliver information, have a heart for other people. And if that's both ways, then you can receive information well and you can deliver information well in an imperfect way. But I think that we're walking into, one of the things I was suggested actually prior to this call was this thing around actually what do we need to change in the existing culture. There's this hideous neoliberal thing. The problem with that is it's impossible to defend yourself against. We can explain why that is in the next session, maybe, Nick, but that's what I'd like to add, if that's helpful.
Yeah. I thought the points raised around middle management are very, very true. Like you just all of a sudden you're going to burden all these people who have not been trained, not been coached to let go of people. It's quite a scary juncture. I think if you are on the receiving end of being let go, I truly believe that 95% of people who are let go, it really is not their fault. That something fundamentally has happened in that business, and especially in times we're in right now. I think the issue I've seen is that if you feel like you've been unfairly let go, you rush out, you'll run and get advice, usually sadly from like a friend or someone who thinks they're a lawyer or something like that, and then you've instantly got yourself into a situation where you are defensive. I've watched numerous businesses go through some horrible times, and the guys who've come out of it best are the ones who've had a bit of, I mean, it's a weird thing to say, it's a very brave thing to do, but have empathy for your employer, what they might be going through, right? Which, I mean, you're the one getting done over and it hurts like hell. But actually, if you can try and be supportive through that process, you will end up maybe getting a better deal through like what is a horrible negotiations, but also just being able to actually move on properly and live your life rather than sort of having a bitterness that you sort of carry around with you. And just do, if you think you're in the runnings right now to be potentially let go, you can assess your manager and you're like, has this guy ever done anything like this? No, he or she will be absolutely bricking it for this moment. And because they have no training, they're going to read out a piece of paper that tells them exactly what to do, which is going to make you feel like a piece of shit. And that is not their fault either, right? Now, big businesses and founders who neglect this stuff, I think, is terrible. I think they should be lined up and shot. The ones who bring people in to let go of people, I'm like, I have a special place for them. But I think this, not to sound like Gwyneth Paltrow, but I think what everyone's spoken about is Ollie's feedback, like constant feedback loop in great environments is great. And how many businesses really have that sort of intensity around sort of feedback? Not so much from what I see. It's more monthly basis, from a week to week sort of basis. But I think if you can sort of this unconsciously uncoupling sort of phrase that Gwyneth Paltrow came up with, there should be a natural ending point to these places if you told people. And I think right now, if you take a UK European standpoint with what's going on with furloughs and the potential mass exodus for employees, I think employers would be doing a lot of people favours by saying there's a roadmap of probably not working out to let people mobilise now, rather than becoming one of X million, sadly, if furlough schemes don't protect them. And most people should know what to do there. David, what advice do you have for anyone who's sadly going through sort of a firing process at the moment? Where should their head be at?
Probably a lot of the things that you've just raised. It is an incredibly emotional time, but where possible, try not to let your emotion drive. It's very easy to do something from an emotional place that in the cold light today, a few weeks or a few months later, you look back and go, I probably wish I hadn't done what I'd done.
Yeah.
Not least in terms of references or just leaving well. And often industries are quite small, and the what's the great phrase? The toes that you trample on today might be connected to the bat you got to kiss tomorrow. Most industries are quite small, and reputations are built on us on these things. So the first thing is try not to get over emotional about it. I think your advice there of just putting yourself in the employer's perspective, they might have lost a contract that costs them a heck of a lot more. That's the implication of it, and that's not you. That's just the situation. I think try not to get in your own head about it. I'd get out and do things. Don't spend your time sat at home feeling sorry for yourself. That's a very natural temptation, what a lot of people would do. But just try and get out there. it's slightly one of those things that the more people you talk to, the more people have got fired, and they'll give you some really good advice. And actually, it's never really fatal. It just hurts in the moment. So just talk to people about it, and you'll probably find some of the most successful people you know go, yeah, I got fired from a job. I knew it was coming. It was rubbish. It was a rubbish place for me anyway, and it set me on this path, and now I'm doing this. Oh, right, okay. So a lot of it's about the mindset side, I think too. So just try and put yourself as best you can in a really positive mindset.
Yeah. And not every founder or leader we admire has, had a disastrous track records up to a point, right? They've taken some real pain, and it's benefited them benefited massively. I do think from a recruiting standpoint, not to go on about this, but I just watched a CFO recently leave a very high-profile role and went all over LinkedIn after they got fired for basically not sharing board packs, which is fairly standard in what you do. They went on a LinkedIn rant about how this business is, not very good, right? After doing 3 years of their life promoting it and celebrating it and all that kind of stuff, and I just got there's just a flurry of people going like, is this a person I want on my team now? Is this the kind of person who, chips get down? It's very unfortunate they've been let go, but that kind of public display gets remembered really, really quickly. And now, look, I'm not against whistleblowing. If something is really wrong, absolutely, the bravery to say about that, coming across any kind of sort of bitterness, is a different issue. And the States have this way more than Europe. The States is becoming incredibly political places to work, and companies are expected to have, very strong political views, where still in Europe, it's work, and we sort of just and crack on. But I think just being in that very emotive state you're living in, just stepping back and just thinking about what is your brand, what is the perceived brand you want, how am I staying on brand for my future employees? Because there are certain things I'm seeing at the moment where they won't be forgotten, right? Or they won't be coming across as the most professional for moments ever. Ollie, to round off, what advice would you give to anyone who's going through these horrible experiences?
To be honest with you, I probably see it as an opportunity. Like, as I think all these points have been really, really valid, and sometimes it's hard not to get emotional about it all, right? But the crucial part is, you're here for a good time, not for a long time, and there's an opportunity to explore your own potential. So why would you want to waste it at an organisation, a team, or an institution that doesn't recognise that value, or equally you don't quite fit in there? It's all about optimizing your own potential. So, as David said, these things often happen for a reason, and sometimes it's difficult to see the woods from the trees in that moment. It's often because it's been handled badly or managed poorly. But the long and short of it is that you have a skill set, you have a talent, you have an ability, and it works in certain environments. Your challenge is that you've got to go and find what that right environment is.
Just one last thing, Nick, I'd like to add to this. I think this is a very serious issue. So I think David mentioned about in my own words, sort of not acting when you're angry. Very important not to act when you're angry. It's actually a biblical thing, oddly enough. But that said, right, it's not unforgivable, because trust me, anyone on this call or anybody listening to this has got the propensity to get angry and find themselves in that situation. The challenge with that is to forgive people, okay, if that happens, and also to put your arms around them and say, look, because we do find ourselves in those situations. So let's not think that we're not immune to that, because it's definitely. But I think it's vitally important from this call we just recognise just what an urgent situation this is. And I think the other thing I'd say is actually in all of this is not a time to stick your head down at all, right? In all of this, it's a time to stick your head up and actually start taking action, because there's a lot of people who are silent in this situation, too afraid to do anything. And the challenge is actually oddly enough, to stick your head above the parapet, do the right thing, because it's the only way we're going to sort this situation out. So, you know, it's vital, Nick. And if that means losing a job, so be it. In my view, I think that's the right thing to do. There are not many organisations, large organisations, I would trust with my well-being or career, because they're utterly irresponsible for the reasons I tried to articulate. And this neoliberal thing is almost impossible to navigate without the right skills. That's the reason why I do what I do, to try and develop empathy and relationships between people to prevent these things from happening. As Ollie just said, you know, within that window, you know, we can still be very fair and loving to people and treat them with respect. So for whatever period of time they're with us, which is now, all we have is now, we can treat them well, and, you know, and hope that we get this right. But, you know, let's not try and be whiter than white and think, if this happened to us, I wouldn't do that on LinkedIn. Trust me, you can find yourself in that situation. And I think,
I think that's spot on. I think also, if you're a leader and you've had someone resign to you, like the amount of people who then go and badmouth that guy leaving, to the point where if they turn around and say, "Can I come back?" they put themselves in a spot where you're going, "Is this the guy you thought was rubbish?" And like, "Oh yeah, no, he's fine now." Like it's amazing that way. Like, you know, emotions need to be controlled on both sides for that, and, you know, managers need to realise, like, you like this guy yesterday, what's really changed? Like, maybe they've just gone through something where the offer of 20 grand more, and lots of them, but they've been there and they've realised the grass isn't greener. You know, who are you? How open are you to those people again? I think it definitely takes two to tango in this world. If
buy yourself a mirror. Leaders should buy themselves a mirror before they look elsewhere and blame employees as well.
Yeah. As you can see by my hair, I don't have a mirror to hand too often, but it's but I'll take that advice. I mean, if anyone at home wants to, there is lots to say on this topic, and there's lots of detail, and all of us are connected to incredible organisations who help guide you through these paths. If anyone wants some advice, depending on your geography in the world, how to go about this, or just an ear to run things by, do reach out, and we're more than happy to put you in contact with some people who can help you navigate through these sort of times. If not, as Ollie said, you know, we're here for a good time or a long time, and so thank you to everyone for your contributions today. Really enjoyed it. Enjoyed Robot Ollie's voice for a bit, which was good. Which is definitely.
Was it sound like a Dalek? A Dalek, like it.
Gave it a little bit of that.
Exterminate.
That's it. We've got. It's a key demographic for us. So don't worry, Ollie. So thanks for hitting that target market as well. It was only for a few seconds, but otherwise, thanks to everyone today again for the continued support. Keep giving us horribly hard questions to answer and explore that could get us in trouble, as it keeps us feeling alive. And we will see you all next week. All the best. Goodbye.